There is a mistake almost everyone makes when they try to deal with their own anger, and it's the exact reason so many people stay angry far longer than the original provocation ever deserved. They fight it, they clench against it, suppress it, tell themselves not to feel it, wrestle it down with sheer willpower, and then wonder why it resurfaces an hour later, sometimes stronger than before. The Stoics discovered something almost 2,000 years ago that modern psychology has only recently caught up to. Anger cannot be defeated by force, because force is exactly the energy anger runs on. It has to be defeated by something else entirely, a kind of quiet, structural dismantling that happens before the anger ever gets the chance to fully ignite. Today, we are going to walk through exactly how the Stoics, particularly Seneca in his remarkable treatise on anger, understood and dismantled this most destructive of human emotions, not through suppression, not through willpower, but through a series of precise philosophical interventions that stop anger at its actual source. Stay with me until the end, because the final principle in this video explains something about the true cost of anger that almost nobody calculates correctly. Back to Accent Stoic, the channel where ancient philosophy meets the battles of modern life. If you're new here, welcome. You've arrived at exactly the right moment. And if you've been here before, you know what we do. We go into the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the letters of Seneca, and the discourses of Epictetus, and pull out what has survived 2,000 years because it actually works. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe now, because this video goes as deep as anything we've made on this channel. The foundational principle: anger is a judgment, not a force of nature. Before we get into the specific methods, we have to correct a misunderstanding so widespread that most people have never even considered questioning it. We tend to think of anger as something that happens to us, a wave that rises up from somewhere beneath conscious control, an involuntary storm we simply have to weather until it passes. The Stoics rejected this framing entirely, and their rejection of it is the foundation of everything that follows in this video. One of the earliest and most systematic architects of Stoic thought, argued that what we call emotions, the Greek word was path, disturbances, were not separate from our reasoning. They were, in his analysis, a kind of reasoning error. Anger, specifically, was defined by the Stoics as the judgment that we have been wronged, combined with the judgment that revenge or retaliation is now appropriate and desirable. Notice what this means. Anger is not a force that descends on you from outside. It is a conclusion you have actively reached, however quickly, however unconsciously, based on an interpretation of events that you constructed yourself. Seneca, in his treatise on anger, written to his brother Novatus, put this even more directly. He argued that anger is the most destructive of all human emotions, precisely because it disguises itself as righteous, as justified, as something other emotions rarely manage to disguise themselves as. Fear announces itself as weakness. Grief announces itself as sorrow. Anger alone convinces you that it is strength, that it is justice, that giving in to it is somehow a form of standing up for yourself. This is precisely why fighting anger through willpower so often fails. You cannot simply suppress a feeling that has convinced you it's righteous because some part of you doesn't actually want to let it go. This reframing changes everything about how you approach anger. If anger is a judgment rather than a force of nature, then it can be examined, questioned, and in many cases prevented from forming at all. Not through suppression, but through addressing the judgment itself before it fully solidifies. Consider what this actually means in practice, because it's easy to nod along with the theory and still fall back into the old model the next time someone genuinely provokes you. If anger were truly an involuntary force like a sneeze or a shiver, no amount of philosophy could do anything about it. You would simply have to wait for it to pass, the same way you wait out a physical reflex. But this is demonstrably not how anger actually works, and the Stoics pointed to ordinary evidence to prove it. The same insult that enrages you when delivered by a stranger barely registers when delivered by a small child, or by someone you know to be joking, or by someone whose opinion you've already decided doesn't matter to you. The external event, the word spoken, was identical in each case. What changed was the judgment you attached to it. This single observation, examined honestly, is enough to demonstrate that anger is never purely reactive. It is always mediated by an interpretation, and interpretations, unlike reflexes, can be questioned, slowed down, and in some cases revised entirely before they finish forming. Principle 1. Catch the impression before it becomes a verdict. Epictetus taught a concept central to Stoic psychology called phantasia, the initial impression that strikes the mind the moment something happens. Someone cuts you off in traffic. Someone insults you in front of others. Someone dismisses your work. In that first instant, before any conscious thought has formed, the mind receives a raw impression of the event. Here is the crucial Stoic insight. Between that raw impression and the full emotional reaction of anger, there is a gap, often extremely brief, sometimes only a fraction of a second, but real and expandable with practice. In that gap, the mind is deciding whether to grant synkatathesis, assent, to the impression, whether to accept the initial interpretation as true and act on it, or to pause and examine it before granting that assent. Most people never notice this gap exists because it happens so quickly that the impression and the anger feel like a single, indivisible event. But the entire Stoic method for defeating anger without fighting it depends on learning to notice and expand this gap. The practice is not fighting the anger once it has already formed. By that point, the judgment has already been made and the emotional momentum is already underway. The practice is intercepting the raw impression before it hardens into a verdict, examining it while it is still just an impression rather than an accepted fact. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly, writing to himself about pausing to ask whether an impression was actually true or merely how something appeared in the heat of the moment. This is not a technique you can only apply in calm, controlled circumstances. It is precisely the technique the Stoics developed for the heat of actual provocation, because that is the only place it actually matters. There is a practical exercise worth describing here, because the gap between impression and assent is not something most people can widen simply by deciding to. It requires deliberate practice, much like any other skill. One version the Stoics effectively taught was a kind of internal narration in the exact moment of provocation, silently naming what has just happened as an impression rather than a fact. Not, "He insulted me," but "An impression has arisen that I have been insulted." This might sound like a small linguistic trick, but the effect on the mind is significant. The first framing treats the interpretation as settled reality, already fused with the event itself. The second framing preserves the gap Epictetus described, holding the interpretation at arm's length just long enough to examine whether it deserves to be accepted at all. With enough repetition, this small linguistic habit becomes an automatic pause built into the mind's very first response to provocation, rather than something that has to be remembered and applied under pressure. Principle 2. Delay is the single greatest remedy. Seneca wrote something in his treatise on anger that remains, 2,000 years later, one of the single most practical pieces of advice ever offered on the subject. He said that the greatest remedy for anger is delay, not suppression, not distraction. Simple, deliberate delay, giving the initial surge of feeling time to pass before any word or action follows from it. Seneca observed something about the nature of anger that makes this remedy so effective. Anger, unlike a settled, considered judgment, tends to lose much of its force simply through the passage of time. He described watching himself and others make decisions in the heat of anger that seemed completely justified in the moment and appeared mere hours later wildly disproportionate to what had actually happened. The Stoics understood that anger operates like a fire that burns hottest in its first moments and cools rapidly if simply not fed with immediate action. The practical version of this principle is almost embarrassingly simple to describe, though it requires real discipline to practice. When you feel the first surge of anger rising, do not speak, do not act, and do not decide anything for a fixed period. Seneca suggested waiting even a single day for serious matters, though for most everyday provocations, even a few minutes of genuine delay accomplishes most of the same effect. The point is not to eliminate the feeling instantly. It is to prevent the feeling from being converted into words or actions before it has had the chance to cool, because words and actions taken in anger are precisely what turn a passing emotional state into lasting damage. A relationship harmed, a reputation damaged, a decision that cannot be undone. There is a story, likely embellished over time but philosophically instructive, of Emperor Hadrian, whose court was steeped in Stoic influence, once telling an aide who had wronged him that he was too angry to decide the man's punishment that day and would decide it tomorrow instead. The delay itself, deliberately built into the process, protected both men from a decision that anger alone would have made far more severe than justice actually required. What makes delay such a uniquely effective remedy, rather than merely a helpful suggestion, is that it works entirely independent of your ability to reason clearly in the moment. This matters enormously because one of the most insidious features of anger is that it actively degrades the very faculty, clear judgment, that you would normally rely on to talk yourself out of it. Trying to reason your way calmly out of anger while still fully inside its grip is a bit like trying to read a book while the room is on fire. Delay sidesteps this problem entirely. It doesn't ask you to reason well while angry. It simply asks you to do nothing and to say nothing for a fixed period, trusting that the biological and psychological intensity of the initial reaction will diminish substantially on its own, given enough time, regardless of whether you actively fought it during that interval at all. Principle 3. Examine whether the judgment behind the anger is actually true. Once you've created even a small gap through delay, the Stoics taught a specific practice for using that gap productively, examining the actual judgment underneath the anger rather than simply waiting it out passively. Remember that anger, according to Stoic analysis, always contains two judgments: that you have been wronged and that retaliation is now appropriate. Both of these judgments deserve genuine scrutiny before being accepted. Epictetus taught that we should ask honestly whether the person truly intended harm or whether they acted from confusion, ignorance, or their own suffering, in which case the framing of being wronged in the way anger assumes may not even be accurate. He also taught that we should ask whether retaliation, even if some genuine wrong did occur, would actually improve anything, or whether it would simply add a second harm to a situation that already contained one. Marcus Aurelius modeled this examination extensively in his private writings. He reminded himself repeatedly that the people who frustrated or wronged him were, in most cases, acting according to what appeared true and good to them in the moment, however mistaken that appearance actually was. This is not the same as excusing wrongdoing. It is a genuine examination of whether the specific judgments fueling your anger, this was intentional, this deserves punishment, this requires my immediate emotional response, actually hold up under honest scrutiny, or whether they were assembled too quickly in the heat of the initial impression before any real examination took place. This principle requires real intellectual honesty, because the mind in the grip of anger is remarkably skilled at constructing justifications that feel airtight in the moment and dissolve the instant they're actually examined closely. The Stoic practice here is not to trust the first, fastest interpretation of events, precisely because that interpretation was constructed under exactly the conditions least suited to accuracy. Principle 4. Recognize what anger actually costs you. Seneca devoted significant attention in his treatise to a calculation that most angry people never actually perform, a genuine, honest accounting of what anger costs the person experiencing it, independent of whatever it might do to the target of that anger. He observed that anger disturbs sleep, damages judgment, strains relationships, and in many historical cases he documented led directly to decisions that caused far more harm to the angry person than to whoever had originally provoked them. Anger, in Seneca's analysis, is not a cost-free response to injustice. It is an expensive one, paid for by the very person who believes they're simply defending themselves. This matters practically because most people, in the moment of anger, are implicitly running a calculation that assumes retaliation or emotional expression is essentially free, that expressing anger costs nothing and might even provide some benefit, whether deterrence, satisfaction, or a sense of justice served. The Stoic response is to make this calculation explicit and honest. What will this anger expressed actually cost you in the relationship, in your reputation, in your own peace of mind for the rest of the day or the week? And what will it actually accomplish realistically compared to what you're imagining it will accomplish in the heated moment of feeling it? Marcus Aurelius wrote, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it." This is not a moral platitude. It is a genuinely practical observation, borne out repeatedly in both ancient accounts and modern experience, that the damage caused by an angry response very often dramatically exceeds the damage caused by whatever originally provoked it. Try running this calculation honestly the next time you feel anger building over something significant. Not the version of the calculation your anger wants you to run, which typically inflates the benefits of retaliation and minimizes its costs, but an actual, sober accounting. What is the realistic best-case outcome of expressing this anger fully right now in the way it wants to be expressed? What is the realistic cost to the relationship, to your reputation, to how you'll feel about yourself in a week? In the overwhelming majority of cases, when this calculation is run honestly rather than through the distorted lens anger provides, the costs turn out to be substantial and concrete, while the benefits turn out to be vague, temporary, and largely limited to a brief feeling of righteousness that fades quickly and rarely improves the actual underlying situation. Principle 5. Use the view from above to shrink the provocation. The Stoics practiced a specific mental exercise, sometimes called the view from above, in which you deliberately imagine the situation provoking your anger from an increasingly wide perspective, first from across the room, then from above the building, then from above the city, then from a vantage point encompassing your entire life, and finally from a perspective encompassing the vastness of time itself. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly in his meditations, reminding himself of the almost incomprehensible scale of time and space relative to any single provocation he might be facing on a given day. He wrote about the brevity of human life, the vastness of eternity before and after it, and the relative insignificance of most daily frustrations when measured against that scale. This was not meant to diminish the reality of genuine wrongs. It was meant to correct a distortion that anger reliably produces, the sense, in the heat of the moment, that the provocation in front of you is larger, more significant, and more deserving of your total emotional investment than it will actually appear to be in a week, a year, or a decade. The next time you feel anger rising over something genuinely minor, a rude comment, a frustrating delay, a small slight. Ask yourself honestly how much this specific moment will matter in 5 years. In most cases, the honest answer is almost nothing at all, and simply asking the question sincerely often does more to shrink the emotional charge of the moment than any amount of willpower applied directly to the feeling itself. Principle 6. Replace the impulse to retaliate with the choice to model something better. The final principle addresses what happens after anger has been examined, delayed, and its judgments questioned, the actual choice of how to respond once the initial storm has passed. Marcus Aurelius wrote one of the most quietly radical lines in the entire Stoic tradition on this subject. He said, "The best revenge is to not become like the one who wronged you." This inverts the entire logic that anger typically assumes. Anger tells you that the appropriate response to wrongdoing is to match or exceed the harm done to you. The Stoics taught that the actual measure of strength is precisely the opposite. Maintaining your own character, your own standards, regardless of how the other person behaved, is a far more complete victory than any retaliation could ever provide. Not passivity, and it's worth being clear about that distinction, because the Stoics were never advocates of simply tolerating genuine injustice. Justice, one of the 4 cardinal Stoic virtues, sometimes requires firm, even forceful, response to genuine wrongdoing. What the Stoics rejected was the specific emotional state of anger as the engine driving that response, because anger, as we've established throughout this video, clouds judgment precisely at the moment clear judgment matters most. A firm, appropriate response delivered from a place of calm clarity is, in Stoic terms, an entirely different act than the same response delivered in the grip of unexamined rage, even if the external actions look superficially similar. Bringing it all together, and look at what we've actually built today. 6 principles, recognizing anger as a judgment rather than an involuntary force, catching the impression before it hardens into a verdict, using delay as the single greatest practical remedy, examining whether the judgments underneath the anger are actually true, honestly calculating what anger actually costs, using the view from above to shrink provocations to their proper scale, and replacing the impulse to retaliate with the deliberate choice to model something better, that together explain exactly how the Stoics defeated anger without ever needing to fight it directly. This is the deepest insight underneath everything we've covered tonight. You cannot successfully suppress a feeling that has convinced you it's justified. The only way to genuinely defeat anger is to dismantle the judgments that produce it before those judgments fully form, or, when that window has already closed, to examine them honestly enough that they lose their grip on their own. This is not about becoming a person who never feels anger. Even Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, surrounded by betrayal, war, and constant provocation, almost certainly still felt the initial flash of anger regularly throughout his life. What separated him from most people was not the absence of that initial flash, but the discipline of never letting it convert automatically into words or actions before being properly examined. It's worth being honest about something before we close. None of these 6 principles will make you a person who is simply never angry, and the Stoics never promised that outcome, nor did they consider it desirable. The goal was never numbness. The goal was mastery over what happens between the first flash of feeling and whatever comes next. The words spoken, the actions taken, the relationships damaged or preserved. That gap, however brief it feels in the moment, is where the entire practice of Stoic philosophy actually lives. Everything else in this tradition, the writing, the reading, the daily review, the premeditation of adversity, exists largely in service of widening that single gap, so that when provocation eventually arrives, as it always does, there is enough space inside it to choose rather than simply react. Challenge for tonight, not 6 challenges, just one. Think of the specific situation in your life right now most likely to provoke your anger in the coming week. A person, a recurring frustration, a predictable source of friction. Choose just one of these 6 principles and decide right now in advance how you will apply it the next time that provocation arrives. Not perfectly, just once, sincerely, and notice what happens differently, both in the situation itself and in your own chest afterward. Marcus Aurelius did not develop this kind of composure overnight, despite ruling the most powerful empire in the ancient world. He practiced it every single day, in the private pages of a journal he never intended anyone else to read, examining his own anger with the same rigor he applied to matters of state. That same practice, built one honestly examined moment at a time, is available to you starting with the very next provocation that tries to pull you off balance. Video gave you something today. Hit the like button. It costs nothing, and it tells us this kind of depth is exactly what you want more of. Leave a comment and tell me honestly, which of these 6 principles do you think will be hardest for you to actually practice, not just understand? I read every comment on this channel, and I'll be down there with you. Subscribe to Accent Stoic if you haven't already. We go this deep every single week into philosophy that has survived 2,000 years because it was built for exactly the hardest, most ordinary moments of a real life. Until next time, stay grounded, stay rational, and remember what Marcus Aurelius told himself on the mornings the world felt heaviest. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength.